Well, hi there everyone, and a very warm welcome to Talk 11 out of 12 in our teaching series on the book of Hebrews. Well, if you've followed every talk so far, then I've got some good news for you. I can now announce that there's going to be a prize on offer for anyone who can show me that they've listened to all 12 talks in our series. It's not a great prize, but it is a prize nonetheless. How about that? You weren't expecting that. Well, if you have been following the previous 10 talks, you'll know that there's been a glorious flow to this letter so far, because the writer's been exhorting his Jewish Christian readers not to turn their backs on Jesus by returning back to the Jewish synagogue and to the ways of the Old Covenant, to abandon Jesus and his gospel. Don't do it, he's saying. And he's been couching his arguments using both carrot arguments and stick arguments. Now, let me explain. If you want to get a donkey to move forwards, then you might dangle a carrot in front of the donkey as an incentive. So the donkey looks at the carrot and goes, "Ooh, I think I want to move forward, get my carrot." That's one way of doing it. Or else you might want to move the donkey forward by threatening it with a stick. "Go on, donkey, move forward." So the writer to the Hebrews has been using both carrot and stick approaches so far in his arguments. So on the carrot side of things, he's saying this: can't you see that it's Jesus who's your real leader now? He is your rescuer. He is your friend. He's your pioneer into the future. And he's God's choice as your great high priest. He's just so superior to Moses and the angels. And the new covenant that he's brought in is just so superior to the old covenant that was over you in your old days in the synagogue. So you've just got to put your faith and trust in God, just like your heroes before you did. Just read Hebrews 11 for his list of the heroes that preceded these Jewish Christians. Just do what they did and put your faith and trust in God. Because do you know, there's a wonderful rest awaiting you in the future if you stay true to Jesus. And then on the stick side of things, he's given out 5 warnings which are essentially saying the same thing. If you do decide to abandon Jesus and his gospel, now we're not talking about sin now, we're talking about a permanent walking away from Jesus. If that's what you're going to do, then beware. God knows, and there will be a reckoning on the final day. Hebrews 10:26 says, "No sacrifice for sins is left, but only a fearful expectation of judgment." Can you see, he's saying, that by jumping off the gospel train in this way, just to use the illustration that we've used before, you're coming out from underneath the protection of the gospel. Now, I'm aware this is not a popular teaching these days, but I really can't see any other interpretation of these 5 warnings. Well, that takes us all to where we are now, the start of chapter 13. And you might have thought that the writer has now completed his arguments to his readers. Surely this is the end of the letter, there's nothing else to say. So a whole chapter more comes as a bit of a surprise. And the writer is actually suddenly shifting our gaze. He's been giving us some marvellous theology up to now that's been getting us, well, first of all, to look upwards at the God who's now able to welcome us into his presence because of what Jesus has done. We're now clean, we're now forgiven. And he's also been getting us to look forwards into the far future, to a day when we're going to enjoy a rest with Jesus on a new, restored planet Earth. But suddenly, the writer takes us away from these things to start focusing on the here and now. And he's saying that actually being a part of the new covenant ought to affect the way we live here and now. It ought to affect what we're doing, the choices we make, our lifestyles for the rest of this day, for the rest of this week, for the rest of this year, and for the rest of our lives, of course. So it's suddenly very down-to-earth stuff in chapter 13. It's as if he's saying, this new covenant of grace, which I'm urging you all to stay in, is not an airy-fairy thing. Just because we're now living under grace and not law doesn't mean that we're just free to do anything that we choose. He's saying that you're now new creation people. Surely, therefore, you're wanting to please God by the way you live your lives. Surely you're not wanting to offend God by the way you're living your lives. So I want to give you a bit of help here, he's saying, because I'm now going to show you some areas of life in which you can now live out your membership of God's new covenant family, how you can please him and not offend him. And that's what Hebrews 13 is all about. There's very little theology in it. There's just one section that's all about Jesus, and I want to keep that for our final talk next week. So what we're going to look at today is very simple, very straightforward stuff. There'll be no difficulty in us understanding what's going on. Brett William, if you're watching this, you'll be able to cope with this really well. Now, I should say that Brett William in our church is very bright and very intelligent, but he's not yet one, as I'm actually speaking this out. So, here we go then. Broad sweep of issues affecting all of our lives. We're going to receive some basic instructions on each one. I just pray now that with God's help, I can add a bit of extra value as we go through. Okay, here we go. Verse 1. Keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Up on the screen. Now, I can remember back to becoming a Christian at the age of 19. And one of the big surprises I remember is that the other Christians started to call me brother. And I can remember it feeling good. It meant that I belonged in this new family that I just joined. I was being welcomed in as a new member. Now, I'm not sure how common it is these days for us to openly address one another as my brother or my sister. But what I do know is that if we do so, then we're being thoroughly biblical. It's reminding us that no matter if we're completely different, from completely different backgrounds, so you'd think we had absolutely nothing in common, actually we do. We share the closest bond possible, that of God's Holy Spirit joining us in a very real and profound way. So, it's great. We can love one another. We're in the same family. And loving one another is the responsibility that comes with being a part of this family. It comes with the privilege. And loving one another is an action thing. It doesn't happen up here. It happens with the way we behave towards one another. It's an action word. Now, I can remember when our children were at high school, Jenny being 4 years ahead of Phil. And although we had the odd occasional difficult moment at home, Jenny knew instinctively that when Phil began at high school, the lowest level of course, that it was her responsibility to watch his back and to keep an eye on him. And when people looked like they were going to give Phil some trouble, it was very much a case of, if you mess with him, then you've got to mess with me. It was love in action. And God holds us responsible for loving one another, for caring for one another, for looking after each other's backs. Don't leave this to someone else. Now, the encouraging thing for the Hebrew Christians is that they were already doing this. So the word for them is keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. In other words, keep going, you guys. You're already doing well on this one. Right, moving on to verse 2. Show hospitality to strangers. Now, hospitality is another mark of the Christian community. And Romans 12, verse 13, is equally blunt about this point as well as the previous one. Here it is on the screen. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Well, we've just looked at that. Practice hospitality. It's as direct and to the point as the Hebrews writer. Now, the point I want to make about being hospitable is that it's basically just another expression of your love for other people. You know that Christianity is essentially an inside-out faith. It starts from the inside of you where the Holy Spirit lives, and it just spills out to the outside world. You receive love from God, and then you've got love to share with other people. That's why you might consider visiting people in prison. And that's what the Hebrews writer covers in verse 3. Now, here's my word on hospitality. Godly hospitality has nothing whatsoever to do with being proud of your house and proud of your cooking, and it gives you a chance to show off. No. Or to put it the other way round, if your cooking talents and your home are, shall we say, modest in comparison to others, then do not be ashamed and feel unable to offer hospitality. There's just no place for this kind of inverted, snobbery shame stuff in a Christian community. Let me tell you that one of the best hospitality moments I've ever received happened when I was out in Romania, where a single mum we visited offered us lunch. Now, it was more than lunch. I mean, she lived in a very run-down home, but what we saw when we entered inside was a tremendous spread of food laid out for, it was the three of us, for just the three of us. And we learnt later she'd actually borrowed money to put it on. So you can imagine that for us to express our gratitude to her and honour her obvious sacrifice for us, we just had to eat for England, basically. Now, you see, she'd actually received some help from the organisation that I was representing, and she wanted to express her gratitude to us in the form of this enormous lunch. But I can tell you, it was very humbling to see that. Now, let's go back to this verse from Hebrews. It's as if the writer is taking hospitality between people within the Christian community for granted. He's saying that you need to move on from this and to start to extend the same hospitality towards people outside the Christian community and, in fact, to strangers. This is the commentator Tom Wright, who we've heard a few times during this series. This is his comment on this. The hospitality which so marked the early Christian community must be extended wherever possible, with the fascinating promise that in opening your front door, you never know when an angel is going to walk in. It happened to Abraham in Genesis 18. It can happen to you. well, I'd be keen to receive stories from anyone who's extended hospitality in this way, and you think that actually an angel walked in. I wonder. Well, these things do happen. Right, let's move on to verse 4. Here it is. Marriage should be honoured by all. And then the writer continues on in his blunt fashion. And the marriage bed be kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. So he's starting to get a bit heavy now. Well, what can we say about this, apart from making the obvious point that it really does deserve a sermon all to itself? Now, first of all, let's be clear about the meaning of this word marriage. I'm speaking, and most of you will be listening, in the UK in the early 2020s. And in this age and in this culture, I think it's fair to say that marriage is regarded by many as, well, simply a social construct. It's kind of a legal arrangement between two people that can be flexed as society changes and changes its values over time. So this marriage thing can now incorporate two men or two women if they're in love with each other. And if it's clear that a marriage is struggling for any reason, why? Then a divorce and starting again with a new relationship is considered to be perfectly normal now. And it can take the form of a civil partnership with no reference to the word marriage in it, or it can take the form of simply living together if the partners so choose. Okay, I hope you'll agree that that's where we're at today. And as Christian people, we can feel the tug of our culture on us, just to be tolerant about all of this, just to live and let live, just to go with the flow. I mean, I felt that as I was preparing all of this for you, and I can feel it again now as I'm speaking. Just to go with the flow. So we do have a decision to make as a Christian community, whether we're going to go along as well with popular opinion, with mainstream society, and be relevant, or whether we're going to come under the authority of God's revelation to all mankind. So it's our conviction that mankind did not create itself, and is not therefore free to tamper with our Maker's order in creation. So we have to hold that marriage is not fundamentally just a legal arrangement defined by the state. It's a creation ordinance defined by God himself. And it applies to everyone on the planet, not just to Christian people. That's our stance, and the authority behind it comes from the Bible, the Word of God. Now, this is Jesus speaking, clarifying this divine ordinance in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 to 5. It's coming up on the screen now. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So marriage and the sexual union that follows is a man and a woman thing. It's the way God has designed our bodies. Now, as we said, this view will clash with mainstream culture, which is all about, I must be true to myself and my feelings. And unbelievers are often quick to jump on a Christian stance and pour scorn on our beliefs because we're dancing to a different tune than mainstream culture in our country. But the authority from our convictions comes, as I say, not from popular opinion, not from personal opinion, but from God's revealed word to us all. As Martin Luther famously said once, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Furthermore, to honour marriage is to take the covenant that was made on your wedding day very seriously indeed. In some instances, there will be a clear pastoral reason why a divorce may be permissible. But never forget that may be so, but a divorce is always a violent breaking of a covenant agreement with God, the founder of marriage. So it can never be undertaken as a light thing simply because we've fallen out of love, and besides, I've just met a new lover. Now, if you know of people struggling in their marriage, then know that as a church we can help with marriage counselling and Christian ministry. We've found that this can bring God's grace and wisdom to bear in helping to bring about reconciliation and a fresh joy into a marriage in which cracks are starting to appear. We've had experience of that both in our church and in previous church. So we're in the business of mending marriages wherever we can, because divorce can never be an easy option within the Christian community. Note that the Hebrews writer is also clear about adultery. That's having a sexual relationship outside of your marriage. And this, together with other forms of sexual immorality, comes under the judgment of God, he says. Well, if we need some encouragement after hearing all of that, this is Phil Moore, a commentator we've been using throughout this series, and he makes the following interesting point in his Hebrews commentary. This teaching was just as unpopular in the first century Roman Empire as it is today. By refusing to worship sex as a god, or to despise it as something gross, the Christians offended both the promiscuous and the prudish. Yet note this, they also won the Roman Empire over to Christ when it finally grew sick of the bitter aftertaste of its sexual promiscuity. We will win our generation to Christ in the same way if we hold firm to the Bible's teaching and proclaim that pure sex is the best sex. Well, very good from Phil there. And there's a lot to discuss there. Right, we move on to verse 5. Be content with what you have, by keeping your lives free from the love of money. Now we're going to get more guidance on this from the Apostle Paul. First of all, he's got something to say to the young Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10. And this is an oft misquoted verse. He reminds Timothy that it is the love of money that is the root of all kinds of evil. Now note, it's not money itself that's the problem, and nowhere is someone condemned in the Bible for being rich, although having great wealth does bring with it its own temptations, so I'm told. No, it's the love of money that's the problem. It's never being satisfied, always wanting more, never trusting in God. Now, when a reporter once asked the American oil billionaire J.D. Rockefeller how much money was enough to satisfy a person, he quickly replied, "Just a few dollars more." Conclusion, money can be a very helpful servant, but it can be a terrible master if it's the object of your love and affection instead of God. And we say this whether your starting point is from having much or from having just a little. Well, secondly, is it possible for Christians to be free of the love of money? It does have a powerful pull on people. Well, let's go back to Paul. This time he's writing to the Philippian church. In chapter 4, verse 13, he makes this statement, which, again, has often been misused. Here it is. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Well, what does this mean? That he can jump a mountain? Or more seriously, that he's equipped for every kind of Christian ministry with the full range of gifts? Or, if he was a single parent, that he could bring up the kids, hold down a job, serve as a deacon in the local church, while simultaneously undertaking a few fascinating long-term DIY and gardening projects. After all, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. No, that's not what Paul is saying here. Read the context and you'll see that Paul is simply saying that it is his relationship with Jesus that is the reason why he's able to rest content with his situation in life. Riches for the Christian is not about money. It's about the quality of life you can enjoy as you walk through life with Jesus and with your church family. That's riches. Now let's go back to Hebrews, because the writer's now going to make the same point. Here it is. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Seen that already. Because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Now there speaks a rich man who knows that God is with him. Well, let's finish this section with a word of wisdom from another of our commentators we've been using throughout this series, Tom Wright. He has this to say. When you find yourself making a sacrifice of something else in your life, simply that you can follow where money is beckoning you, regard that as a danger signal. Yeah, wise words. Right, moving on. Relate well to your leaders is the final point that Hebrews is going to make in chapter 13. And this chapter has got a lot to say about how to relate to leadership in God's church family. So with regards to church leaders, we should, number 1, remember them. Number 2, imitate them. Number 3, come under their authority. Number 4, greet them. Now, are these easy things for us to do? Or are they difficult? Or even downright impossible? Well, we encounter leaders of people in many walks of life. Prime ministers, presidents, head teachers, the boss at work are obvious examples for us. And for any young people watching, your parents in the home. Now, we might remember these people, although the Hebrews word has the sense of actually caring for them. But are we able to go further than that? Are we able to imitate them, submit to them, or even greet them? Well, maybe you would with church leaders who take 1 Peter 5 verses 2 to 3 seriously. Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but by being examples to the flock. Now, that's leadership, true leadership in the church. Leaders who live out these 2 verses are leaders you want to follow. Leaders whose primary motivation is to serve the church, not to follow some kind of professional career path, not find a niche in society whereby you can look important and boss other people about, not say one thing from the pulpit and then do something else. Leaders who are real disciples of Jesus, in other words. They're the ones to follow. Now let me tell you one leader I'd be happy to remember, to imitate, to submit to, and to greet. I've been listening recently to him speaking 10 years ago at a conference in which leaders from all over the world had gathered, and were all happy to be under his overall leadership. Now, they would all call him Terry, and they knew that before being called into church leadership, Terry Virgo had spent time as a young man knocking on doors for Jesus in a council estate in Brighton. And you listen to him speaking, and he comes across as a man just passionate for Jesus, a real worshipper of Jesus, but so relational for the leaders, so caring for the leaders and their wives, many of whom have sacrificed much for the mission of New Frontiers. There's often laughter in the middle of a talk, either because Terry himself has cracked a joke. He does a splendid impression of the great Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones in one talk I was listening to. Or maybe there's some banter coming up from the floor, and Terry has to join in with that and eventually re-establish some kind of order. He supports Brighton and Hove Albion Football Club, but we can forgive him for that. Terry Virgo is much loved. He isn't unique, of course. There'll be other world leaders like him. But Terry has modelled the 1 Peter verses we read about before to many hundreds of church leaders and would-be church leaders. Let me just leave you with a quote from his book, The Spirit-Filled Church, which gives you a feel for his leadership style. He said this: "I thank God for the red-hot zeal for Christ that I find in my friends, and I thank God for the riotous times of laughter we enjoy together, as well as the days of prayer and fasting. God has called us to be friends. Jesus called his disciples friends." Well, to be honest, relating well to such leaders shouldn't be a difficult thing. So that, as Hebrews 13 verse 17 asks for, their work will be a joy and not a burden. So this is conclusion time. What is Hebrews 13 really all about? It's saying to Jewish Christians thinking about returning to the Old Covenant, this is a taste of what life in the New Covenant should be like. It's great, isn't it? So stick with it. Stick with it, please. And for those of us watching today, this is a taste of what life in our churches should be like. We love each other as brothers and sisters. We're hospitable, even to outsiders. We honour marriage and pure sex. We're content with our lot, and we relate well to our leaders. And that's great, isn't it? And we want to stick with this as well, don't we? Well, here's a final provocation for you all from the book of James. It's saying, don't deceive yourselves by just listening to today's talk and doing nothing about it. This is chapter 1, verses 22 to 24. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. Well, I wonder what action points have arisen for you from Hebrews chapter 13. This isn't just interesting or fresh knowledge or just teaching. There should be action points as God's Spirit works in us, provoking us and convicting us, not condemning us, but convicting us of things we need to adjust and things that we can change in order to honour God and not offend him. Well, next time is our final look at the letter to the Hebrews, and we're going to end this series the way we began it, by focusing on Jesus himself. So we're going to be looking particularly at verses 11 to 16 of chapter 13. And so do have a look at it in advance. And don't forget about the prize I was talking about as well at the beginning of the talk. So thanks for listening, everyone. Take care, and may God bless you all.
Thank you for tuning in. We hope you have enjoyed today's teaching and that it is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, please contact us via Facebook Messenger or email us at office@hopechurchthetford.org. We will be glad to hear from you and will endeavour to get back to you as soon as possible. Tune in again next week. We are currently meeting in person on Friday nights. If you'd like to attend one of our services, please let us know and we will send you the link of where you can book in. Have a blessed week.